Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. For 7 days, the skies above Iran have not been quiet. Night after night, the distant thunder of explosions has rolled across cities, deserts, and mountain valleys as waves of air strikes carve through military installations and strategic infrastructure. What began as a regional confrontation has quickly evolved into something far more dangerous, a conflict that now threatens to spill beyond the air and onto the ground. Yet the most surprising development is not the bombing itself. It is the identity of the force that may soon cross Iran's borders. The first boots marching into Iranian territory are unlikely to belong to American soldiers or Israeli brigades. Instead, thousands of Kurdish paramilitary fighters are preparing for what could become one of the most consequential ground offensives the region has seen in decades. From the rugged mountains of northern Iraq, Kurdish forces have begun quietly gathering along the frontier. For them, the coming operation represents something far greater than participation in a regional war. It is an opportunity, perhaps the best opportunity in generations, to reclaim a portion of what they consider their ancestral homeland. For Washington and Tel Aviv, the logic is different but equally compelling. Air power has inflicted severe damage on Iranian military networks, yet bombs alone rarely collapse governments. Regime change requires pressure on the ground, and if that pressure can be applied without deploying large numbers of Western troops, it becomes politically and strategically attractive. So as the war enters its seventh day, a new phase looms just over the horizon. The skies have already been conquered. The question now is whether the mountains of western Iran will soon echo with the sound of marching armies. On Wednesday, March 4th, the world briefly believed the invasion had already begun. In the span of a few hours, open-source intelligence trackers and regional analysts began reporting unusual activity along the Iranian border. Armored vehicles were allegedly moving. Kurdish fighters were said to be advancing. Social media filled with grainy clips claiming to show columns of troops heading south toward Iranian territory. Then the story exploded. An Israeli media outlet released a report suggesting that thousands of Kurdish fighters had already crossed the border and were pushing into Iran. The claim spread quickly through geopolitical circles. Well-connected journalists echoed the report. Analysts scrambled to interpret what it meant, and suddenly the narrative hardened. The ground war had begun. But something felt off. Normally, a military operation of that scale would leave unmistakable signs: satellite images, verified combat footage, or at the very least a flood of eyewitness reports. Yet the expected avalanche of evidence never appeared. The internet had erupted into speculation, but the battlefield itself remained strangely quiet. Within hours, the narrative began to unravel. Kurdish leaders speaking with international reporters denied that any full-scale offensive had started. Experts who had initially sounded alarms began walking back their statements. By the following morning, most major outlets quietly corrected the record. Still, the panic had revealed something important. Even though the invasion had not yet begun, the conditions surrounding it were real. Kurdish forces were gathering, preparations were underway, and when the offensive did eventually arrive, as many analysts believed it would likely be far larger than the rumors that briefly swept the world. To understand why Kurdish fighters could suddenly become the spearhead of a war inside Iran, you first have to understand who the Kurds are. Scattered across the mountains and plains of the Middle East, the Kurdish people are one of the largest stateless nations in the world. Roughly 25 to 30 million Kurds live across the region, with millions more forming a diaspora far beyond it. Their homeland, known as Kurdistan, does not exist on official maps. Instead, it stretches across portions of 4 modern countries: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. The borders that divided them were drawn in the early 20th century after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, leaving Kurdish communities split between multiple states that often viewed Kurdish nationalism as a threat. Inside Iran, Kurdish populations are concentrated in the northwest along the mountainous frontier bordering northern Iraq. Just across that border lies Iraqi Kurdistan, a semi-autonomous region that emerged after decades of conflict and international intervention. Over time, it has become a political and military hub for Kurdish movements across the wider region. For many Kurdish fighters, Iranian Kurdistan, which they often refer to as Rojhelat, meaning the eastern lands, represents unfinished history. Kurdish groups seeking autonomy or independence have operated there for decades. though many of their armed wings have historically based themselves outside Iranian territory to avoid overwhelming retaliation. What makes the present moment unusual is the convergence of opportunity and capability. Across the Middle East, Kurdish militias have accumulated combat experience from years of fighting insurgencies and extremist groups. They possess fighters, weapons, and hardened command structures. And now, with Iran weakened by war from the air, some Kurdish leaders believe the door to Rojhelat may finally be opening. The Kurdish fighters now gathering along Iran's borders did not emerge in isolation. For decades, Kurdish militias have maintained a complicated and often uneasy relationship with Western powers. At different moments in modern Middle Eastern history, they have served as allies, proxies, and sometimes convenient partners in conflicts far larger than their own struggle for autonomy. Their cooperation with the United States became especially visible during the wars in Iraq and Syria. Kurdish forces proved to be disciplined and motivated fighters, often operating effectively alongside American air power and intelligence support. In battles against extremist groups such as ISIS, Kurdish units became some of Washington's most reliable local partners, holding territory, coordinating strikes, and sustaining long campaigns in difficult terrain. But that relationship has never been simple. Kurdish leaders have long memories of moments when international support faded as quickly as it appeared. Political agreements, shifting alliances, and regional pressures have repeatedly left Kurdish movements exposed after serving broader strategic goals. For many Kurds, cooperation with Western powers carries both opportunity and risk. Even so, Kurdish militias remain uniquely positioned in the region. They operate through a network of paramilitary organizations, some loosely aligned, others fiercely independent, yet many share overlapping political ambitions. When their interests align with those of powerful allies, they can mobilize quickly and with surprising coordination. And that alignment may now be forming once again. As the conflict with Iran intensifies, Washington and Tel Aviv face a familiar dilemma: overwhelming firepower in the air, but limited options on the ground. In that strategic gap, Kurdish fighters appear once more as a potential solution. Experienced, motivated, and already standing at the edge of Iran's western frontier. From a purely military perspective, the current war against Iran presents an unusual imbalance. In the air and at sea, the United States and Israel possess overwhelming advantages. Their aircraft can strike targets across large portions of Iranian territory, and their intelligence networks allow them to identify command centers, missile batteries, and logistical hubs with precision. Yet history has shown that air superiority alone rarely determines the fate of governments. Bombs can destroy infrastructure and cripple military capabilities, but they do not occupy cities or remove regimes from power. If the ultimate objective is to force political collapse inside Iran, pressure must eventually be applied on the ground. That is precisely where the strategic dilemma emerges. Washington has shown little appetite for deploying large numbers of American troops into another Middle Eastern war. Years of costly interventions have made U.S. leaders deeply cautious about committing ground forces, especially against a country as large and complex as Iran. Even if the military could carry out such an operation, the political cost would be enormous. Israel faces its own limitations. The Israeli military is designed primarily for territorial defense and rapid regional operations, not for occupying vast stretches of foreign land. Launching and sustaining a ground invasion deep into Iran would stretch its capabilities far beyond their intended purpose. This is where Kurdish forces suddenly become strategically valuable. They are already positioned near the Iranian border, experienced in irregular warfare, and motivated by their own political goals. For Washington and Tel Aviv, Kurdish fighters offer something extremely rare in modern conflict: a potential ground force capable of applying pressure inside Iran without requiring Western armies to take the lead. If Kurdish fighters are indeed preparing for a major offensive, it did not happen overnight. Reports from diplomatic and intelligence circles suggest that the groundwork for such an operation has been quietly unfolding for months. Long before the bombing campaign began, discussions were already underway about how Kurdish groups might be organized, armed, and coordinated for a potential ground push. According to multiple sources, both Israeli intelligence and American agencies played roles behind the scenes. Israeli intelligence services were reportedly involved in helping to funnel weapons and logistical support into Kurdish networks, while American officials maintained discreet contact with Kurdish political leadership. The objective was not simply to arm fighters, but to align several fragmented groups around a shared strategic goal. One of the most significant developments came when several major Kurdish political parties representing Iranian Kurdish interests formed a coalition. Their armed wings, previously operating with limited coordination, began to present themselves as a unified front. This kind of political alignment is rare in Kurdish politics, where internal divisions have often complicated larger ambitions. At the same time, communication channels between Kurdish leaders and Western officials intensified. Reports circulated of high-level discussions involving American policymakers and Kurdish representatives, exploring what role Kurdish forces might play if the conflict with Iran escalated further. While many of these conversations remain opaque, the pattern suggests careful preparation rather than spontaneous uprising. By the time the world began noticing Kurdish units massing along Iran's border, the machinery of cooperation was already in motion. Training, funding, and strategic planning had quietly built the foundation for an offensive that, if launched, would reshape the battlefield far beyond the mountain passes where it begins. While Kurdish fighters gathered along the frontier and foreign intelligence agencies quietly coordinated behind the scenes, Tehran was not blind to the shifting landscape. Iranian officials began to speak more openly about the threat building along their western border, warning that any attempt to exploit the war to fracture Iranian territory would trigger severe retaliation. Signals of concern quickly turned into action. Iranian forces launched missile and drone strikes against facilities linked to Kurdish political groups operating just across the border in northern Iraq. Offices associated with Kurdish parties were targeted, sending a clear message that Tehran considered the growing mobilization not merely a political challenge, but a military threat. At the same time, Iranian leaders began issuing increasingly stark warnings through state media and diplomatic channels. Any Kurdish incursion, they declared, would be treated as an act of war orchestrated by foreign powers. Tehran's rhetoric framed the potential offensive not as a local insurgency, but as part of a broader attempt by the United States and Israel to dismantle the Iranian state. Behind the public statements, Iranian military planners were already preparing for a scenario they had long feared, a conflict in which outside powers could use ethnic and regional fault lines to destabilize the country from within. Kurdish insurgencies had appeared before in Iran's history, but never under circumstances where the nation was simultaneously under sustained aerial attack. In Tehran's view, the threat was not simply the arrival of Kurdish fighters crossing a border. It was the possibility that such an advance could ignite a chain reaction across Iran's diverse and often restless regions. And if that happened, the war that had begun in the skies could suddenly erupt across the entire country. If the Kurdish offensive does begin, the opening phase would likely unfold along the mountainous frontier separating northern Iraq from Iran's western provinces. This region is rugged, broken by steep valleys and narrow passes that have long served as natural corridors for insurgent movements. For Kurdish fighters familiar with the terrain, those mountains offer both concealment and strategic advantage. Initial advances would probably involve several thousand fighters moving across the border in coordinated columns. Iranian Kurdish militias would likely take the lead, acting as guides and forward units because of their familiarity with the local population and landscape. Behind them, additional Kurdish forces from Iraqi Kurdistan could follow, bringing heavier equipment, armored vehicles, mortars, and artillery pieces capable of supporting a sustained push. At the same time, the offensive would almost certainly rely on modern battlefield tools that Kurdish forces have increasingly adopted in recent years. Small, unmanned drones could scout Iranian positions, identify defensive strongpoints, and relay real-time intelligence to commanders. Mortar teams and mobile artillery would provide fire support while fighters maneuver through the difficult terrain. Above the battlefield, American and Israeli aircraft would likely play a decisive role. Airstrikes could target Iranian radar systems, armored formations, and supply depots ahead of the advancing forces, creating corridors where Kurdish units could move with reduced resistance. In effect, the ground offensive would operate under the protective umbrella of Western air power. But the goal of such an operation might not be a dramatic march toward Tehran. Instead, the offensive would likely focus on securing footholds inside Iranian territory, strategic towns, border outposts, and logistical corridors that could sustain a longer campaign. From those positions, the pressure on Iran's military would begin to mount. At first glance, a Kurdish offensive might appear limited, a few thousand fighters pushing across remote border terrain. But the real significance of such an operation would lie in the strategic dilemma it creates for Iran's military command. To stop the advance, Tehran would be forced to respond quickly and decisively. That response would almost certainly require the movement of conventional Iranian forces. Tanks, armored vehicles, and large infantry formations would have to deploy toward the Western Front in order to block Kurdish progress and retake any captured ground. But concentrating those forces would carry a serious risk. Large troop formations are exactly the kinds of targets modern air power is designed to destroy. If Iranian units gathered in the open to halt the Kurdish advance, they would become visible to surveillance aircraft and satellites. Once located, those formations could be struck by precision-guided munitions launched from American or Israeli aircraft already operating in the region. In that sense, the Kurdish offensive could function as a strategic trap. The advancing fighters would not necessarily need to defeat the Iranian army directly. Instead, their presence would compel Iran to expose its military assets, drawing tanks, artillery, and supply convoys into positions where they could be targeted from the air. Faced with that choice, Iranian commanders would have limited options. Allowing Kurdish forces to move deeper into Iranian territory would be politically unacceptable, but committing large forces to stop them could gradually weaken the broader defensive network protecting the country. And as those forces shifted westward, the pressure on the rest of Iran's military system would begin to grow. A Kurdish offensive would not unfold in isolation. Iran is a vast and diverse country, home to multiple ethnic communities with their own histories of tension with the central government. If fighting erupted in the northwest, other regions might begin to see opportunity. An opportunity in geopolitics can spread faster than armies. South of the Kurdish regions lies Khuzestan, an oil-rich province with a significant Arab population. For years, small militant groups there have pushed for greater autonomy, sometimes resorting to insurgent attacks against Iranian infrastructure. A weakened central government distracted by a Kurdish advance could suddenly face renewed unrest in the southwest. Far across the country in the southeast lies Sistan and Baluchistan, where the Baluch population has also maintained long-running insurgent movements. Baluch militant groups have developed a reputation for complex guerrilla operations along the borderlands with Pakistan and Afghanistan. If Iran's security forces were stretched thin, these groups might attempt to expand their campaigns. Then there is the north. Along the Caspian frontier, Iran shares a border with Azerbaijan, a country whose leadership has occasionally hinted at territorial ambitions tied to the region's large ethnic Azeri population. Relations between the two states have been tense for years, and any major disruption inside Iran could create pressure for Baku to assert its influence more aggressively. In this sense, a Kurdish offensive carries the potential to ignite something far larger than a localized insurgency. What begins as a border crossing in the mountains could cascade into multiple crises unfolding across Iran's vast geography. And once such a chain reaction begins, controlling its direction becomes almost impossible. Despite the strategic appeal of a Kurdish offensive, the risks surrounding such a gamble are enormous. Wars rarely unfold according to the neat logic drawn on briefing room maps. Even if Kurdish fighters succeed in establishing footholds inside Iran, the political consequences could quickly spiral beyond the expectations of those who encouraged the operation. One possibility is that the offensive could unify rather than divide Iran's population. Many Iranians harbor deep frustrations with their government, yet foreign-supported incursions into Iranian territory could provoke a surge of nationalist sentiment. In that scenario, communities that might otherwise oppose the regime could rally around the idea of defending the country's territorial integrity. The Kurds themselves would also face serious dangers. Iran possesses significant missile and drone capabilities, and Kurdish bases across northern Iraq could become immediate targets for retaliation. Moreover, Kurdish expansion inside Iran might alarm neighboring Turkey, which has long opposed the growth of Kurdish-controlled territory anywhere near its borders. There is also the question of long-term consequences. If Iran's internal balance collapses, the result might not be a smooth transition to a new government. Instead, The country could fracture into competing factions and armed groups, creating a prolonged civil conflict across one of the most strategically important regions in the world. For policymakers considering such a strategy, this is the central dilemma. A Kurdish offensive could place extraordinary pressure on the Iranian state, but it could also unleash instability that spreads far beyond the initial battlefield. As the war continues to unfold, the possibility of Kurdish fighters crossing into Iran remains uncertain, but the strategic logic behind it is increasingly visible. For Washington and Tel Aviv, the idea offers a way to translate aerial dominance into pressure on the ground without deploying large numbers of their own soldiers. For Kurdish groups, it represents a rare moment when global geopolitics might align with long-standing ambitions for autonomy. Yet history offers many examples of such gambles producing consequences that no planner fully anticipated. The Middle East has often been shaped by interventions meant to weaken adversaries, but which ultimately reshaped entire societies. A Kurdish advance into Iran could become one of those turning points. If successful, the operation might stretch Iranian military forces across multiple fronts, weaken central authority, and create the conditions for dramatic political change. But if miscalculated, it could ignite years of internal conflict, destabilize neighboring countries, and redraw alliances throughout the region. For now, the mountains along Iran's western border remain tense but quiet. Kurdish fighters wait. Iranian forces watch carefully, and the world's major powers weigh the risks of a move that could alter the balance of power across the Middle East for a generation. In wars like these, the decisive moment often arrives not with certainty, but with a single decision, the moment when waiting ends and history begins to move.